Whenever we are trying to calculate a rate, a growth rate, or a change in things, what we're looking for is the change in the value divided by the base for that value. And so in this story, we're looking at the change in nominal GDP over time divided by the base of that value, and we're going to use the 1990, the earlier year, as the base. So the difference, the change in it, would be this minus this. So this is going to be equal to 5995 minus 5803, and then we can divide that by 5803, and we'll get out a rate. And when you plug this into a calculator, it's helpful to use the parentheses, 5995 minus 5803, close parentheses, divided by 5803. And you can do that all in one phrase, and it'll give you your number. What number do we get?
0.0308.
So I got 3.3%. Is that right? 3.0? Yeah. Okay, so 3.3%. All right, and that, when you do this in the calculator, you get 0.033, right? Well, since we're talking about a percent, you just move the decimal 2 spaces over, and you get 3.3%. Now, is 3.3% growth a good number? Is that a good growth rate? Sure, that's respectable, right? At 3.3% a year, we can use what we talked about in chapter 7 as the rule of 70, right? And take 70 divided by 3.3, and what do you get? You can get 21 or 22?
Yeah, about 21.
21? So at that growth rate, GDP will double every 21 years. So your quality of life is doubling every generation. Your kids will be twice as well off as you are. If you get married and have kids at age 21, which, that's probably a little bit early. So that means your kids will even be double better off than you are. Except what? Except what we're talking about here is the nominal GDP, and what we're really interested in is the real growth rate. In order to find the real growth rate, we have to control for what? Price change or inflation. So then, how can we know what the inflation rate was between 1990 and 1991? What we would want to know is how much have the prices of everyday goods and services that most consumers buy changed between 1990 and 1991. And there are numbers to help us do this. Remember, the government collects the Consumer Price Index. And so we can look at the Consumer Price Index. And in 1990, the Consumer Price Index was 130.7. But the Consumer Price Index in 1991 was 136.2. And just looking at that, does that look like a big number or a small number? Have prices changed a lot or a little? I mean, what you used to spend $130 on, now you have to spend $156 on. Can we calculate the inflation rate using these two numbers? Sure. It would be 136.2 minus 130.7 divided by 130.7, and what do you get? Does anybody want to contradict that?
I got 4%. It was 0.042.
Okay. Yeah, that's what he said. So 4.2%, right? So if inflation goes up by 4.2%, but nominal GDP goes up by 3.3%, what has actually happened?
You haven't really grown.
You've actually gotten smaller, right?
Yeah.
your capacity to buy things has actually gone down. Your real GDP has gone down, or at least the nation's real GDP has gone down. What else might I want to know in order to identify how your life has changed? Yes?
Your income, like, for example.
If I could get your income, that would be good. All I have is averages. What other information might I include in this to try to understand how well the average person's quality of life has changed?
The GDP capital, or no?
I want to get to the per capita. How do I get to per capita? I need to know the population, don't I?
Yeah.
Okay, so then I should probably try to find what the population was in 1990 and what the population was in 1991. So the U.S. population in 1990 was 248.7 million. The U.S. population in 1991 was 253.5 million. So what am I going to want to do? Wash, rinse, repeat. Same thing again, right? So I can find my population growth rate by taking 253.5 minus 248.7 divided by 248.7. And what do I get?
I got negative, or tripping?
Shouldn't be negative.
Yeah, negative 5%, or
No, you did something wrong. Try again.
I got negative 89%. I don't know.
So 253.5 minus 248.7. That should be a positive number, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to divide that number by 248.7 and get a percent.
1.9.
1.9 is what I got.
Yeah.
So that's 1.9%. What does that number mean? The population grew by 1.9% that year. Does that mean that for every 100 people there were 2 new babies? That would be a lot of babies, right? If 1 out of every 50 women you knew had a baby in a year, that would be a lot of babies. What other things might be happening? Yeah, go ahead.
Immigration.
Yeah, immigration. And immigration was quite common, actually, in the early 90s. As a matter of fact, the Republicans were a very pro-immigration party at the time. You go back and watch old speeches from George Bush Sr. and Ronald Reagan at the time, and they were trying to find ways to increase immigration. There's an irony in that. Okay, so then this will dilute the nominal GDP even more, so that actually the average person is not only worse off by roughly 0.9%, but also a little bit worse off because of change in population. What we would really want to know is what the GDP per capita was. Am I right? So then I have this data from Fred, which is the Federal Reserve Board in St. Louis's website. And what they did is they report GDP per capita in constant 2012 dollars. So neither $1990 nor $1991. Let me give you the numbers for the years around that. So 1989, 1990, 1991, and 1992. GDP per capita went from $37,000, 271. Oh, by the way, this is real GDP per capita because it's in constant dollars. Up to 37,000, oops, down to 032. Then 1991 was 36,971. And then in 1992 was 38,077. So what can you tell me? Well, from 1989 through 1990 and 1991, real GDP per capita was going down. People were being made worse off during that time period until we get to 1992 when it goes up again. Are you with me? Now you could calculate the rate of growth for every year, and this would be negative, and this would be negative, and then this would be positive. I'll leave that as an exercise for the students. Now, when real GDP per capita is going down, what do we call that? Well, we could call that a recession, right? Usually, in the United States, we have an average real GDP growth rate of somewhere between 2 and 3%. So if we think about the economy over time and think about our quality of life, we understand that our quality of life has been improving at the rate of around 2 or 3% a year, such that our quality of life doubles every 26 to 35 years. So this is growing at somewhere between 2 or 3%. But we also know that it's not growing at a constant rate of 2 or 3%. It's got ups and downs. We're in the middle of a down right now. It's got ups and downs. Ups and downs. What do we call the ups and downs? We call that a business cycle. Which might be a misnomer because it might not have so much to do with business. So between 1989 and 1991, right, especially the years 1990 and 1991, what was happening in the world that might result in a decline in per capita GDP in the U.S.? Yes?
The Iraq War.
The Iraq War. Do you guys have any familiarity with the first Persian Gulf War that the United States was involved in? Right? You might not remember it because you weren't alive yet, but there was a war. Okay, I was a freshman in high school when this happened. What was going on? You've got this country, Iraq, and then this other country nearby called Kuwait. And Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, invades Kuwait, and the United States flies in to defend Kuwait and fight Saddam Hussein. Why? Yes?
Oil.
Oil. Good answer. Oil. Why did Hussein attack Kuwait in the first place? You see, the countries of the Middle East that have oil are in a cartel together. They all sort of coordinate how much each country is going to produce in oil strategically so that they can keep the price of oil high. They want the price of oil high so they can get wealthy. And usually it's that the oil isn't owned by private firms or individuals. Usually the oil is owned by the government or whomever is in the elite of that country. And in Iraq, the oil was owned by basically Saddam Hussein. Now, what happened was Kuwait started producing more than, quote unquote, their fair share of oil, more than their agreed upon quantity of oil, which was pushing the price of oil down. As the price of oil went down, Saddam Hussein got pissed because he was counting on greater profits from his sale of oil than what he was able to achieve with Kuwait overproducing. And Kuwait was just trying to get rich. They're like, forget all y'all. We've got oil, we're going to sell it. So when Hussein attacks Kuwait, does he attack the cities? Does he attack the poor people in the outlying villages? Doesn't give a darn about any of that. So then when the United States comes in, are we defending the people in the cities or the people in the outlying villages? I'm getting to be a little bit controversial here, aren't I? But what makes sense to the economist is that the United States also likes to have oil, but likes to buy it cheap. Now today in the United States, we produce almost all the oil we need right here at home. But back in the 90s, almost all the oil we got was imported either from Canada or from the Middle East. Why? It turns out it's really easy to get oil out of the ground in the desert where the oil is close to the surface. It's really hard to get oil out of the ground in Texas or in North Dakota where you have to frack first, so that the oil that you can buy from the Middle East is less expensive than the oil that you can extract through use of fracking. Fracking didn't even really exist then. We were just starting to figure out how to get oil out of the sand in Canada. So we like to have cheap oil. And so Hussein comes in, he attacks, and he realizes, oh, the US is going to get involved. This is going to be bad for me, and he starts to retreat. But what does he do as he's retreating? Yes?
He lights the wells.
He lights all the oil wells on fire. He burns them, explodes them, destroys them. What does that do? It decreases the supply of oil. You decrease the supply of oil, what happens to the price of oil? It goes up. All the oil fields that were in Iraq were still intact. He's still getting paid for the oil that he's selling that he produces in Iraq, and he has successfully reduced the supply of oil coming out of Kuwait so that his prices stay high. Was it a humanitarian mission on our part? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, well that still doesn't quite explain these changes in GDP per capita in the United States. We need to explain that a little bit further. What do we use oil for? Everything, right? You've got a phone with you, half of that's plastic. I've got a marker here, this is plastic. All those plastics come out of oil. They're produced from oil products. We also use oil to move stuff around for transportation. That's expensive. We use oil in our cars, we use oil in our factories. We use oil to make electricity. So all of those costs, those inputs into the production processes that had to do with the use of oil were causing costs for production to go up, which means that you can make less stuff. And so GDP per capita goes down because we end up producing less stuff. Okay. So we have in the 1990s, the early 1990s, a decrease in GDP per capita. You might call it a recession. We'll get to this later, but you might call that a real shock rather than an aggregate demand shock. And that's going to be an important distinction. When we're at the bottom of a recession, we call this the trough. We're at the peak of an expansion, we call this the peak. The time period while the economy is going down, we call it a recession. Time periods when the economy is growing, we call that an expansion. Now, some people believe that the business cycle falls out of, or is a consequence of having an open market system. That there's going to be business cycles. That's probably true. Because if you allow for innovation, then there's going to be time periods where a lot of new innovation is introduced, and it makes us a lot more productive. So we'll have an expansion period. But then there's a lot of workers that don't know how to use that technology, and so then they fall into a level of structural unemployment, which can lead to a recession. However, most of the time, recessions involve something more than simply changes in productivity. Most of the time, a recession involves something like a real shock or a massive amount of pessimism by consumers or investors. When we enter a recession, the joke goes, if you know somebody, if you have a friend who loses their job, it's a recession. If you lose your job, it's a depression, right? Because you're depressed now. And in the 1930s, we entered into one of the worst recessions of all our history. We called it the Great depression. Our unemployment levels were really, really high. To think about unemployment for a minute, remember our old story about Robinson Crusoe collecting coconuts and fishes? Imagine the entire economy is involved in making coconuts and fishes. We are able to produce this many coconuts and fishes. A recession would mean that for some reason, we are not producing as many coconuts and fishes as we could. That we are underproducing, that some of our resources are underutilized, in particular, people. People are unemployed. What happens when people are unemployed? How do people feel when they lose their job? They're upset. Who are they upset at? They might be upset at their boss or the company that they used to work for. Who do they express that frustration or disappointment to? They might again express that frustration or disappointment to their boss or their old company. They also might release some of that frustration at home with their families. We see domestic abuse increase when there are recessions. Who else might they be frustrated with or angry at? They might get angry at God. Like, God, why have you done this to me? Or they might get angry at their other God, the government. That is, when there is a really deep and persistent recession, and we have put our faith in or trust in the government to maintain stability and security, and they have failed us, we might say to that government, you failed us, we don't trust you anymore, and then what? You might look for a different government. In the 1930s, what were the options available to people for different forms of government in the United States and in the United Kingdom? Great Britain. You had liberal democracy with voting, but there were other options available. Like what? What other kinds of government were popular in the 1930s? Yes?
The dictatorship.
Dictatorships, but there were different kinds of dictatorships. How about fascism? Fascism was a popular form of government at the time, wasn't it? In Italy and Germany. And actually, fascism was really popular in the United States as well. There were a set of policies that had to do with what's called eugenics, which is to try to breed the master race. Most of those policies and ideas were developed in the United States before they were adopted by Germany. They were adopted in the form of policies like minimum wage laws that were designed to push blacks and women and immigrants out of the marketplace for labor. That's where the minimum wage laws came from. That's not necessarily what they're for anymore, but that's what they were there for then. So people are trying to overthrow their government either through fascism or communism. And communism and socialism became popular throughout Europe at the time, including in Great Britain. Actually, Great Britain nationalized many of the major industries like coal during this time period, and those industries remained nationalized all the way until the 1970s and 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. Now, John Maynard Keynes was a member of the elite in Great Britain at the time. He was a member of the Democratic elite in Great Britain, and what he saw was the potential for his position within that society to be eroded and destroyed either by the introduction of fascism or communism. I haven't said whether fascism or communism is good yet, but I have said that Keynes would lose his position as a result. So he was concerned about this. He was concerned about the turmoil that comes when the government is changed. And so he said, you know what? This is really bad. We could just ride it out and wait for the recession to be over, for the economy to fix itself. But he says, if we wait, we might lose the government altogether. So we should do something now. Who's we? The elites. Do something. What? Use the government. To do what? Reduce the recession. So that we maintain political stability. That political stability element is exogenous to the economy. It's different from the economy. It's a political element. It's important to identify that fact. So he says what we should do is we should find a way to reduce the recession. Not make it not quite so bad. And if we can do that, maybe later on it'll also reduce how high the economy gets, how big of an expansion we can get, but at least we don't have this problem of political turmoil. What could happen is that by smoothing the business cycle, three possible outcomes could come out of that. One, we maintain the same growth rate. Two, we harm innovation, reduce the amount of innovation, and increase productivity that happens in the market. And as a result, our trend line for growth declines. We grow slower. Or because it increases stability, we can actually see economic growth improve. Which is the case? I don't know. That's an empirical question. Are you with me? But that's important. Yes?
Is this like kind of going on right now with our economy in like a way how we had like the COVID drop and then we kind of had like a tech bubble? Would that be like considered part of a business cycle?
Sure, a tech bubble might look like this, but the fact that it's a bubble says that that's an illusion, right? Which would imply that there's going to need to be some sort of a correction for that bubble, and that correction would be a downturn.
Yeah.
Now, if I were to put COVID on this, like with this swing, the way that this has been going, COVID would look like this. Or we're hoping that it goes back up. We're about to right here right now. It's been going up. In terms of the number of people who are unemployed, there was a lot of unemployment, more unemployment than just about any other time in history, but now it's increased again. People are going back to work, but now we're in the middle of a second wave, and who knows what's going to happen. So yes, this is completely relevant to your lives today. Okay. And yeah, the government is trying to figure out what to do to get involved. So far they've sent out stimulus checks of, what, $1,200 to most families. And the university has done things that have tried to stimulate economic activity in the sense of making it easier to not come to class every day and finding other ways to try to make it less costly to go to school, although that's not completely the case. There's lots of folks that are doing things like this. A lot of the things that we're not buying right now are luxury goods anyway. So most of the normal everyday stuff that you kind of have to have, we haven't taken away. The government gets involved in two basic ways. They either use what's called fiscal policy, which is activity through the government, through Congress, that introduces new spending or changes in taxes to try to reduce the swings of the economy. Another approach is to use monetary policy. And monetary policy is done by the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. We're going to look at both different strategies that the government employs to try to reduce economic swings and to try to maintain low unemployment and low inflation. And these are the two strategies that they employ. All right. Now I said that the economy has been growing by around 2 or 3% a year, which is to say that our production possibility frontier has been expanding gradually over time. What does that mean in the long run? What does that mean in the long run? Does anybody bake? Any of you like to bake cookies, bread? You've been baking? How much is a bag of flour? About a 5-pound bag of flour.
It's like $2.
It's less than that. It's like about $1.
Depends on where you go with it.
Sorry?
Depending on where you go with it, yeah. It's like
Depends where you buy it, whether you're buying high quality, low quality, right? Bag of flour, let's call it $1 for now. How many calories in a bag of flour?
I have no idea.
About 7,500. 7,500 calories in 1 pound, in one 5-pound bag of flour. That's about 1,850 calories if If you divide that over 4 days, it's about 1,850 calories per day for 4 days. In other words, you could basically live off a 5-pound bag of flour for 4 days if you didn't eat anything else. You mix it with a little water, make some really, really, really nasty bread. And there you go. You could survive on it. And most flour today is enriched.
Unleavened bread.
Sorry?
I said it would be unleavened bread, bread that doesn't rot.
Yes, unleavened bread without any yeast, although there are some natural yeasts in most flour. So it's enriched, which means that you're actually getting a lot of the vitamins and minerals that you actually need every day already in the bread. If we go back in time to 1500, the average peasant working the land and growing their own wheat and then threshing their own wheat and separating the husks and then grinding it into flour and then baking it. To produce the equivalent of 1 5-pound bag of flour required about 3 days of work. Three days of work to get 4 days worth of food. How much does the average American make on a daily basis? Give or take? About $100 a day. Right? If we take GDP per capita, it's a little bit more than $100 a day. So then, in 3 days' time, the average American could earn $300, and with that $300, they could buy 300 bags of flour, which would be enough food to feed a person for 4 years. In other words, right? You work 3 days and you have enough food for 4 years. If that's all you ate. And you could, and survive. So how much wealthier are we than they? It's hard to imagine. It's hard to fathom how much wealthier we are. We're so wealthy that we eat other things besides flour and water. We eat strawberries in February. And fresh green beans year-round. Apples in March. When apples are harvested in the fall, not in the spring, unless you can buy apples from Chile, which we do now. That's how much wealthier we are than they were. It's amazing. It's overwhelming how wealthy we are. I talked to a friend who works for AgriGold, which is a local seed producer. He claims that in the United States every year, just in the United States, we produce enough calories to feed every human being on Earth a daily caloric intake of 3,000 calories a day. And that's just the food produced in the United States. It turns out they grow food other places too. And most of you back at home have a yard that has grass in it, not food, that you could be growing food on. In other words, we are nowhere near a situation where there's not enough food for people. We're nowhere near a situation of overpopulation where there's not enough food to feed people in the world. That's far, far, far away. It's just that our tastes have changed. Our preferences have increased along with our wealth. We follow? Okay. How do we get to this place from this place? What happened? How do we become so wealthy? And that is the correct question. The correct question is not, why are some places still so poor? Poor was normal. Poor was what most people could expect from life for most of human history until we get to about 1800. Most of the world, over time, has been living on the rough equivalent of about $3 a day. And then we get to around the year 1800, when all of a sudden, like the blade of a hockey stick, economic growth took off. Quality of life started to skyrocket. First, in Western countries like the Netherlands and Great Britain and the United States, and now this economic growth has been extending to other places in the world. This is sort of the theme of the book, Factfulness, that I've asked you guys to start reading. Now, I expect you to not start reading it until after the exam, but really dig into that book. It's fascinating. How did this happen? Most economists agree that in order to get economic wealth, you need to have an increase in capital. You have to have more tools. Just like Robinson Crusoe on the island was able to collect a certain amount of coconuts and fish until one day he decided to take some time off and make himself a net. When he made the net, that augmented his labor, which meant that he could catch more fishes and more coconuts. That capital increased his productivity. But what if Friday is on that island, he makes himself a net, and then somebody else comes along and steals his net? What has that done for his productivity? Back down again, right? So then we need not just capital, but we need protection for the capital that people invest in. In other words, we need some sort of private property rights that protect the property that people come up with and that allow for people to sell the things that they make. Crusoe would have been happy to make a net and sell it to somebody else, so long as they paid him sufficiently, his opportunity cost. So we need property rights, but we also need the ability to exchange, and that is entailed in contract law. And between property and contract, we pretty much have the sum of the law. Almost all laws can either be described as property or contract. Contract is basically do all that you've agreed to do, and property is do not encroach upon others or their property. Within these two laws, we get most of what we need for economic development. For the development of capital that augments our labor, that makes us more productive. What kinds of capital are there? Well, there's that net, which is physical capital. There's human capital. Crusoe probably tried a couple of different ways to make the net, and then he became skilled at making the net over time. That's human capital, his personal skill in making the nets. And then there is technological change, which comes about when you find some other way of making a net, or some improved way of developing capital. Feeds into, in the long run, our ability to be productive. However, we need some sort of structure that protects our property and our contracts. We need some sort of an institution that we collectively agree to that then generates rules that are incentive compatible with human behavior. So the institution makes the rules. Those rules generate incentives for how people are going to behave. When we look at people in one country and a different country, and it seems like they're behaving differently, we ought not to first say, well, there's something different about the people in Portugal relative to the people in Spain. Instead, we ought to say, what institutions exist that are generating incentives that are causing the behavior to be channeled in different directions? Racists like to point at the behavior and say, it's just the behavior of those different people groups that are different. Adam Smith said that's nonsense. Instead, we have to look at the institutions. Okay, so how did the institutions change around 1800? Because private property had been around a long time before that. Contracts had been around a long time before that. So how did institutions change in the 1800s? Yes.
Markets, like open markets. Markets.
We did end up with more open markets where people could make exchanges. But people have been using money for exchange for a long time. Exchanges were not new in 1800. There were markets before 1800. So then what caused the change in 1800? Yes?
Then the change in the types of governments.
Some of the institutions changed. Although there's still a queen in England. Now, there was an overthrow of the king in France, but then they put him back in. And then they took him back out again. Then they put him back in again. They took him back out again. The hokey pokey. What really changed? Deirdre McCloskey is an economic historian. She claims that the main thing that happened around this time period was that people found a new way of providing for the bourgeois class dignity. She actually has a book called Bourgeois Dignity. It's one book out of a series of 3, about 1,600 pages altogether. No, I haven't read all of them. I'm working on it. The idea here is that if you invent a new way of weaving cloth, right, it used to be that all cloth in England was woven by hand. You take a thread and shuttle it back and forth between a bunch of threads on a loom. Well, then somebody invented a mechanical loom that enabled one person to make 5 times, 10 times, 100 times as much cloth as a person weaving by hand could make. What do you suppose happened to those mechanical looms?
They were implemented more.
No, the people who were hand weavers destroyed them. They resented the competition. They knew they couldn't compete. And so they tried to block that new innovation from being used. The application of innovative ideas to commercial uses was the major break, was the major barrier. Townspeople didn't really have the same rights as elites, as nobility did. Once the bourgeois class, the productive class, the merchant class, was afforded the same dignity as those who were close to the king, to power, once they were allowed to innovate, earn profits from their innovation, right? And then other people were allowed to copy those innovations. As that happened, the prices of the goods and services that people wanted to buy fell, and more surpluses flowed to consumers. People, for the first time in history, had enough food to eat. Could buy stockings. Look up stockings sometime and see how silk stockings used to be something that the queens used to wear. Right? But now, nylon stockings, everybody can have. Bourgeois has a loaded connotation. Right? It often means the elites or the uppity folks. But what McCloskey is talking about here isn't those kinds of elites. She's talking about the average person who wants to try something new, to have a go. She actually has a new book out with my friend Art Carter. It's called Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich. Right? Leave me alone and I'll make you rich. Not in terms of money, but in terms of the goods and services that you have access to at low prices. Question?
So it's basically innovation, basically?
It's not just innovation. There was innovation in existence before 1800. Kings and generals would hire inventors to find out ways to make better military devices so that they could kill other people more efficiently, right? But those inventions were never moved over to the commercial realm and commercial applications such that it helped the everyday person. It was all about protecting the elites, right? So what kind of military technology has been invented that has now been transferred into commercial use? Yeah?
GPS is one of them, but that's more recent.
GPS, absolutely though. How much time do we save because we all have GPSs on our phones? Tons of time. Imagine how much less gasoline we use because we don't get lost. Using less gasoline pushes the demand for gasoline down, which results in lower prices for gasoline, so we have more money to spend on other things. This kind of innovation and change in the economy is happening all the time because we allow it to happen. You have a question?
No. Basically, like during that time, those were more technological advances?
Because we allowed the bourgeois class the dignity to try and the ability to keep their profits after coming up with a new idea, more inventions happen. But if we took the net away from Crusoe immediately after he invented it and didn't allow him to keep any of the profits, would he have any incentive to make anything else new? To invent a better spear for fishing or anything else? No. By allowing that incentive to work, that profit motive to do its work, we increase the rate at which innovations occurred. We have to explain it by understanding something about people. And without that piece, right, you can look at laws that existed at different periods of time. You can look at the amount of capital that different places have. But without explaining that human element, we really can't explain how is it that we got that incredible economic growth that started in 1800. And then we also don't have the appreciation of how to protect, right, that structure that allows for continued innovation. Right? Leave me alone and I'll make you rich. What if I have to ask permission from my potential competitor before I enter into their marketplace? That's going to make it less likely for me to be able to succeed. I want to be able to innovate without having to ask permission first. In many ways, a lot of the regulations that have been invented in the United States recently create a disincentive for invention because you have to ask permission from your competitor first. Look up the idea permissionless innovation and see how that comes up. That's all I have for you today.